All right, everybody, welcome back to the FITSNews studio, another edition of your Week in Review. I'm Will Folks, the editor of FITSNews, the host of the show. I am not my mellifluous self this week, though. Unfortunately, I've been sick all week. Got something from the kids. It's crazy. You know, the kids get sick for like 5 minutes. Give it to me. I'm on my back for 5 days. But again, that's how it works. We don't stop, though. We keep grinding. Tons of stuff to cover this week. It was far too busy a week to slow down. We've got a ton of developments in the Micah Miller Saga. We've got an explosive lawsuit, an intense interview, and some courtroom developments and potential legislation emanating from this still unfolding saga. We're going to walk you through all that. Also, a huge week in Palmetto politics, the future of the South Carolina Statehouse and the Palmetto State's Congressional delegation at stake in the GOP primary elections this week. We're going to walk you through all the big races you should be following and where they may be headed. And last but not least, I'm going to sit down with Andy Fancher, who dove into the political arena this week with a story of his own that's going to blow all of our other political coverage away. All that and more coming your way on the Week in Review. So we start our coverage this week once again with the saga of Micah Miller, a story that continues to drive headlines, generate attention, and most of those stories over the course of the last week broke right here on FITSNews. The biggest one, at least from my perspective, was the one that Jen Wood, our research director, exclusively reported headed into the weekend. Just a bombshell filing from Allison Williams, the first wife of Myrtle Beach pastor John Paul Miller. Jen, this court filing, a ton of seismic allegations. Walk us through some of the top items that you saw in that explosive filing that was submitted last week in Horry County.
So Allison Williams is seeking sole custody, emergency custody of their 2 minor children. They have 4 children together, and 2 of them are minors. So she was seeking sole emergency custody of those children, and she submitted a complaint along with an affidavit containing a number of just jaw-dropping allegations. Among them, so it began, I think it goes back to 2015, really, when John Paul left Allison to be with Micah Miller. When he left Allison, it sounds like it came to light potential, these are allegations, nobody's been charged, but potential allegations of sexual abuse of underage females within the church community.
By John Paul Miller.
By John Paul Miller, yes. So when those allegations came to light, she said in this affidavit that he blamed his immoral sexual behaviors related to these allegations on the sexual abuse he experienced for years by his father, Wayne Miller.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Obviously, Wayne Miller is very familiar to our audience. Kelly Lyons has published a couple of different reports on some allegations against him. And Jen, isn't it interesting that filing you referenced, seeking the custody of those children for Allison Williams, she pointed out that not only does she want John Paul Miller to stay away from those kids, she wants his father to stay away from them too.
Yep. She was very, very clear in that, a whole separate point. So in the aftermath of that really tore the church community apart. They requested that John Paul agree to undergo treatment for sexual addictions, which according to her never happened. And, the church, when they learned about it, John Paul went right in and amended the bylaws to ensure that all of the decisions were approved by him, including major financial decisions, which I think is interesting given some of the things we're hearing about the church's financials.
Unbelievable. The other thing I noticed, Jen, in this complaint, you had talked about how there were allegations that were made by Micah's family, by her friends. A lot of those allegations, we saw echoes and reinforcement of those in this complaint from Allison Williams. Is a pattern emerging here?
I'm definitely seeing a pattern. I think, people seem to have been very frightened about speaking up over the past, decade or so. And people are coming forward. And I think Allison is one of those people and seems to be very, she's very concerned about the well-being of her children. She had tried to report these alleged sexual assaults on underage girls at the church to Myrtle Beach police. She had tried to get the girls to come forward. They were afraid to come forward. Myrtle Beach police told her that, John Paul is a respected pastor. They're going through a divorce and no one will believe her. So
Oh,
you can
wow.
see why people have been hesitant. They weren't taken seriously for a long time, it appears.
Well, absolutely. And as you've previously reported, Jen, and as we've talked about on this show, when John Paul Miller had his late wife involuntarily committed for that brief period a few months before her death, you'll recall there was some flexing of his connections with the police during that process. So, again, you have these things sort of spark in your mind as you read this complaint. But Allison Williams brought some receipts too, Jen, didn't she?
Yes, she brought a lot of receipts. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, it's completely separate from any of the court filings related to Micah Miller, her estate, by her family, but it'll be interesting to see how these play out with those separate court cases.
We're going to get to those in just a second. Before we move off of this Allison Williams complaint, Jen, two other things I wanted to ask you about. We had a report, Callie Lyons again did some excellent work on this, regarding a suspicious death involving the, I guess, late husband now of John Paul Miller's, I guess we call her his current paramour, his current squeeze, so to speak.
So
Was there some information? This guy died suspiciously, fell allegedly into a pool back in 2021. Was there some connection to that case included in Allison Williams' complaint?
yeah, and I mean, do you want to I mean, we can get into that, but I think Susie Skinner had been the name had started coming up almost immediately after Micah's death. Friends had mentioned her. We had heard about her. They had been dating for quite some time, and everybody kept mentioning the death of her husband, Chris Skinner. Chris Skinner was a quadriplegic, well known in the community, and they had done a lot of fundraising for him to get a motorized wheelchair that allowed him to go on the beach because he loved being on the beach with his family. So apparently, so I'd heard this before this filing, but apparently, 2 weeks before his death, which I'll get into details, Chris had learned about a relationship between Susie Skinner and John Paul Miller, and had demanded John Paul cut it off, stop, dating his wife. 2 weeks later, his wheelchair rolled into the pool where they were living and he drowned. And
Unbelievable.
Allison Williams points out, it is chilling to know the spouses of both Susie and John Paul are now dead, both from tragic events.
That is unbelievable. And again, that's one of the many revelations contained in that filing. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, Allison Williams, obviously her marriage to John Paul Miller collapsed as a result, at least in part, because of his affair with Micah Miller. But Allison and Micah became friends, didn't they, Jen?
So after Micah had been in the mental health facility and got out, she reached out to Allison, and a lot of those communications, including a voicemail that Micah had left for Allison, which is on our YouTube channel, were submitted as exhibits with Allison's affidavit, text messages between the two that Micah needed to talk to her. She's very concerned about the safety of John Paul and Allison's children while they were with John Paul, and she included all of those as exhibits. Like I said, she brought the receipts.
Absolutely. Well, again, that to me was the big news in this story over the past week. Not only because of the level of the allegations raised, but how they really corroborated so much that we've been hearing from Micah Miller's friends and family. Obviously, none of this proven. These are allegations that are made in the context of affidavits, of court filings, but certainly they do not paint a flattering portrait of John Paul Miller. I wanted to shift now, Jen. You had a big interview this past week with one of Micah Miller's sisters, and there were some explosive revelations in that conversation too. Jen, who did you talk with, and tell us what you found out?
So Micah's got three sisters: Destiny, Sierra, and Anna. And we've heard a lot from Sierra and some from Destiny, but Anna finally reached out and said she was ready to talk about, what she had experienced, what she had watched Micah go through in the months leading up to her death. So we sat down last weekend and had a very long conversation, just going through everything. It was the first time she had spoken to anybody publicly. She had a lot of information to share. She was very open, and I really enjoyed our conversation. I think a lot of things that stuck out to me were, I mean, the biggest thing was John Paul's control over Micah Miller for years. Anna had said that, you know, John Paul had a tracker on Micah's phone and would track everywhere she went. I mean, it wasn't like, when you look and see where your spouse is. He was keeping an eye on everywhere she went. She said he would, at the flip of a switch, turn her credit card off so she didn't have access to money if he wasn't happy with where she was. He would show up if she was out to lunch with her sister. He would check where she was and show up at their lunch dates. Um,
Yeah,
just,
and
I
then when
mean,
he
just
wasn't tracking the phone, the car trackers.
right. So when Micah got out of the mental health facility and got another phone, he wasn't able to track it anymore. That's when the trackers started appearing on her cars that she was driving. So it was a lot.
Well, Jen, you've got a chilling component of this conversation here where you spoke with Anna and she related how that control extended beyond the grave. Let's listen to this clip about what the Miller family dealt with as they were trying to see the body of the late Micah Miller. Let's take a listen.
Even after she passed, John Paul still had control over her, which is super important.
Yeah.
That even her own family couldn't even see her whenever the funeral. She was in the other room, and legally, like the funeral home owner was so awesome. He was calling up our lawyer, his lawyer, like, what can I do to let this family be for their daughter, sister? And there was nothing that they could do because John Paul and her were still married, even though they had filed for divorce, separation, everything.
Yeah. I mean, it was so sad that, you have to kind of put yourself in their shoes. That is, the last time they're getting to see their sister, their daughter. And for them to have to go through that in addition to the loss is just heartbreaking.
Now, there was another interesting component. I was listening to this interview and something really stood out to me. It was a comment that Anna made about the potential for financial investigation of the church. Let's take a listen here.
She had told one of our family members that she reported John Paul to the IRS the week that she passed away. The church, she or not John Paul, but the church. Well, the church is John Paul, so
Right.
either one. Whenever you say Solid Rock, it's John Paul. All of the money is all intermingled, and it was said that he was moving around all his assets into his oldest son's name or his friends' names. So it didn't look like he had as much as he had while they were going through this divorce.
All right, Jen, we keep hearing about these allegations of financial issues with this church, financial irregularities, moving assets. What do you make of this, Jen?
So, Anna said that after Micah got out of the mental health facility in February, that she said she went to work. She started documenting everything, collecting, information about what was going on at that church, because when they separated, those assets are going to be split. So she knew that she had to have her ducks in a row. And that call to the IRS was apparently just one of the many things that she had done in the weeks and days leading up to her death.
Yeah, the
Um,
timing's important here too, isn't it, Jen?
right. Yeah, it was the exact week that she died. And Anna said what doesn't make sense to them is that she had just paid her attorney $5,000 days before she died. She said, if this was something she had planned, why would she take money that had been loaned to her from a member of the church to help her get out of that marriage and pay an attorney for the divorce? Just so many of these things don't make sense to them. And, looking at it, they don't to me either.
No, absolutely not. I mean, people wonder why this cloud of suspicion is hanging over the investigation. And again, we're going to continue to refer to it as a suicide. That's what it's been officially termed. But man, every day that goes by, there's more questions and concerns about the integrity of that conclusion. But Jen, let me ask you this as we start shifting a little bit here toward what happened toward the middle part of this week. There was obviously a court hearing in Horry County, South Carolina, the city of Conway, where this hearing went down, but it was over quickly. Walk us through what happened legally as it relates to the case. Again, this was supposed to be a divorce hearing. Micah Miller was scheduled to be in court with her attorney for the first hearing related to her divorce, but instead it ended up being what, Jen?
So this hearing had been, when she filed for divorce right before her death, had been set up, and it was to, start to begin the division of assets. And, for Micah's family, they continued with that hearing after her death because they want to get her personal belongings that were collected by Robeson County Sheriff's Office, in the course of the investigation into her death. They want her phone, her car, everything that was, left in the vehicle. And I think it's just a big part of what they're looking into. And we expected fireworks. We weren't really sure. You don't usually get to family court and see, explosive hearings, but, we were gearing up for it. And shortly before, we heard from attorneys close to the case that they had come to an agreement with John Paul, and that hearing was no longer going to be a lengthy hearing. It was more of, they were all meeting to sign off of that agreement in front of Judge Bromell Holmes in
Well,
Oregon.
here's a clip from Regina Ward, the attorney for the Francis family, detailing what went down in the courtroom. Let's cut to that.
One of the primary issues that we were seeking a court order from the judge is possession of Micah's personal property that's being held in the possession of Robeson County Sheriff's Department. As you've probably seen, the property that's with them is her personal cell phone, her purse, whatever's inside her purse, her vehicle, and whatever's in her vehicle. As far as anything beyond that, we're not sure what all is available there, but that was something that we wanted to make sure that we got in our custody. So as part of the consent order, the parties have agreed that would be Sierra Francis on behalf of her sister Mica. She stands in as the plaintiff for Mica at this point, and Mr. Miller have agreed that that property will be released from the Robeson County Sheriff's Department, or if they've put that property with somebody else, another investigative authority. When all authorities are finished with that property and have no longer any use for it, in other words, they've finished up whatever investigations or whatever they need that property for, then that property is going to be turned over to my office. It will not be released to Mr. Miller. And that does not mean that he doesn't have the right to see what's on a cell phone, which we're all interested in looking at. We also don't know what else may have been in the purse or the wallet or anything like that. His lawyer would be able to ask us about having access to it too. But right now, we are very satisfied and happy that he has been advised by his attorney to allow us to get that property in our possession.
All right, so that again, Regina Ward, the attorney for the Francis family. I want to bring in Dylan Nolan here. Dylan, you were actually at that press conference, and tell me if I'm mistaken here, but most of the press conference was not about what happened in court. It was about proposed legislation related to this case.
Yeah, Regina Ward spent, it was about an hour press conference, and I think 50 minutes of that were spent discussing coercive control legislation, which is something that's been implemented about 10 years ago in the UK and a couple of other European states. But basically, it expands the definition of domestic violence to include a number of other behavior patterns which one can do to exert control over another person's life, whether that be financial by doing stuff that kind of already falls under stalking statutes, threats of physical violence. But what it allows prosecutors and judges to do is look at an expanded list of ways that one can exert control over somebody else and make a decision as to whether they are the victim of inappropriate control in a sense that's not taken into account under the "are you beating your wife" type of domestic violence legislation.
Now, Dylan, you pointed out in your article covering this press conference, there are a few proposed bills already being bandied in South Carolina. Walk us through a couple of those. Who's sponsoring them? What would they do?
Yeah, these bills have been introduced into both the House and the Senate. They're pretty much identical, and neither of them have gotten anywhere. It's some pretty boilerplate coercive control legislation. In the Senate side, it's been introduced by Lexington County Senator Katrina Shealy. She is a perpetual advocate for victims' rights issues, for women's issues. So this is no surprise at all to see her sponsoring something like this. It's still a fairly novel legal concept in the United States. There are a couple of states which have implemented it, some of which have only done so in the last 12 months. So, I wouldn't expect South Carolina, frankly, to be on the forefront of something like this. However, states like New Jersey, Massachusetts, and a couple other northeastern states have dipped their toes in the water. So we'll see how that plays out in the courts there, whether these charges actually end up being brought. On the House side, a bit more of a sponsor who you wouldn't expect, and that's South Carolina Freedom Caucus Chair R.J. May. I reached out to him on this bill, but we're a couple of days ahead of a primary election, which he's fighting for his life in. So we haven't gotten the opportunity to have a sit down, so I can kind of understand how he got hooked up with this type of legislation and how he came to introduce it. So it's coming from two kind of disparate sides of the Republican Party ideologically, I'd say, which I think is a good thing for proponents of the bill to have a broad coalition of people pushing it. That being said, in both the House and Senate Judiciary committees, the bill, it hasn't picked up sponsors. It's been referred to committee, but it's never been taken up at the committee level. So legislatively, right now, it's about dead in the water. Now, this is something that the family and, of course, Attorney Regina Ward were hoping to change through public pressure at this press conference.
Well, you've got a clip here. Let's hear Regina Ward addressing this coercive control issue in these proposed bills. Let's take a listen.
As it always is, there's two sides to every story, right? There's the side of the story that the position that the family takes that Mr. Miller is somehow responsible for her death, whether that's directly or indirectly. Obviously, it's been declared self-inflicted, so that is off the table. There is questions about whether this type of behavior would drive someone to take their own life. We do not know what was inside of Micah's head. Of course, her husband takes the position that she had a mental illness, that she didn't have her medication, and that the reason she did what she did was because of a mental illness, specifically bipolar. So to say that the judiciary failed her, because I don't know what really got her to that point, I have some suspicions, but I do know this. Based on all of the stuff that I have reviewed, the things in the journals that Mica left in my possession, tell me that a lot of these behaviors happened assuming that what she said was true, and I have no reason to believe it wasn't. If the law had been in place at the time, she could have reported these types of behaviors, and the police would have been able to look to that particular law, assuming that when it went to the governor for signature, that it would be in the same format or better or harsher or whatever. So I think that is a possibility, but to say for certainty is not possible. What I do know for certainty is that there are people who are being victims of manipulative and psychological abuse that's often overlooked and this bill will help every one of those people. And that's husbands, wives, women, and husbands or men as well. So it's not gender specific. This happens on both sides.
Right, obviously, Attorney Ward very passionate about this issue, but Dylan, there's different perspectives on this, and in fact, some of those perspectives could inform why legislation like this has not been implemented, including here in South Carolina. Walk us through some of the pushback on the coercive control debate.
Sure. So as soon as I heard Attorney Ward, talking about this legal framework, it's something that I've been vaguely familiar with, but I hadn't done extensive research. But of course, after this press conference, I wanted to see where has this been implemented and what have the effects been. And so the place where we have about 10 years of data to look at it is the UK. So that's where I was looking at UK news sources primarily. And one of the big problems that existed, at least within the first few years of implementation, that you can find articles talking about is it's really hard to enforce some of this coercive control stuff because a lot of it is not easily documented and it's not stuff that's inherently criminal. So it seems like it's really difficult for prosecutors to know exactly when and how to bring charges. And, if it's difficult for prosecutors, it's even more difficult for law enforcement personnel who have far less schooling in legal matters to understand exactly when the line needs to be drawn. And I think that's something that Attorney Ward said that kind of perked my ears up during the press conference as to why this would be so difficult for law enforcement personnel. Is she cited as an example your husband not giving you money to buy new boots, saying you have boots at home. Now, if your husband's not ever giving you money to buy anything, obviously that's something that can go into the realm of coercion. But if you're a police officer who shows up to somebody's house on a DV call and they say, well, my husband never gives me money to buy boots, and this is literally something that the attorney arguing for this legislation was, citing as an example, well, you're probably going to be reticent to throw somebody in the back of your squad car on something like that. So I think there's definitely a difficulty in enforcing this type of legislation. And I think there's also a fear that should it be overzealously applied, if there's a group of judges and attorneys who are kind of colluding to go overboard on this could easily lead to a situation where folks are bringing domestic violence cases that might stray too far. It's interesting because under the current domestic violence statute, there are a lot of people who can be victimized completely legally. And should a framework like this come into effect, almost anything, if a judge deems it to be done coercively, could be the grounds to be found guilty of domestic violence. So it almost is a litmus test for how much do you trust the judiciary to get it right. Because if a framework like this was implemented in South Carolina, yes, it could prevent another situation, that has horrific outcomes like the things that we've seen here. But if it's implemented improperly, it could be the grounds for an already not completely well-functioning family court system to turn into an absolute nightmare.
Let me bring Jen in, and I want to ask her about this. Obviously, there's got to be a line drawn somewhere between coercive control behaviors that rise to that level of criminal domestic violence or abuse and those that don't. Jen, do you have any thoughts on where this line should be?
So, yeah, I mean, I look at the allegations coming from Micah Miller's family, from our conversation with her sister. And, you see very, very specific application of that control. When, she went out to lunch with Anna said if he wasn't happy with her doing something, he would shut her phone off or he would shut her credit card off, cutting off access to, her money, to her communications as a punishment for doing something he didn't like. So, I mean, I do think that there's definitely a balance. And when Dylan said, can we trust the judiciary to get it right? That is a valid concern. It would definitely have to be something drafted very carefully, and also training would have to be given to police officers and police departments across the state in how to apply these laws.
And then also it raises the question of what is a criminal act that the state needs to prosecute, and then what is something that could be pursued via a civil remedy. And Dylan, speaking of civil remedies, I wanted to ask you this. You fired off a question at this press conference regarding a potential civil action related to this case. Walk us through this, Dylan.
Right. Yeah, I don't know that Attorney Ward loved my question, to be honest with you, because she seemed to be there that day to, lobby for her bill, which she has every right to do. But what I really wanted to know is, does the family and does Attorney Ward intend to use the civil courts to try to figure out if there is any more liability to be apportioned to Pastor JP for his wife's untimely death? And she said that she has been retained specifically for that purpose. However, they don't have enough information at this point to come forward with a legal action, but it certainly sounds like they are preparing to take that kind of action.
Interesting. Guys, just this story continues to defy expectations. Again, in this past week alone, a bombshell complaint, an explosive interview, a big court hearing talking about draft legislation. We are going to continue to follow all of these different angles, not only on this case, but now as it has moved into this broader arena of proposed legislation. We're going to keep tabs on that facet of this story as well as it moves forward. Jen Wood, can't thank you enough for your amazing work. We referenced Callie Lyons earlier. Got to give her another shout out this week for the excellent reporting she's done on this. And of course, Dylan Nolan going down there to Horry County this week to cover this event firsthand and bring us the details on this coercive control debate. Can't thank you guys enough. Dylan, stick around. We've got a segment coming up on South Carolina politics. Stay tuned for that coming up next. So we're going to pivot to politics. Obviously, a huge election week here in South Carolina, one that will determine not only the composition of the Palmetto State's congressional delegation up in Washington, D.C., but perhaps more importantly, if you're a South Carolina taxpayer, who controls the powerful legislative branch of government in Columbia, South Carolina. There's a lot at stake this coming Tuesday in the Republican partisan primary here in South Carolina. I'm joined with Dylan Nolan. Before we get into partisan primaries and congressional delegations, Dylan, let me ask you the question that's on a lot of folks' minds. Did or did not the President of the United States poop himself at a ceremony over in Normandy Beach?
Well, yeah, folks that aren't familiar, let's roll the tape here. So I don't know what was going on there, but clearly something strange. And yes, as you say, a lot of people are speculating that he dropped a dookie in his drawers.
I tell you what, it's amazing. You look at the mainstream media coverage of anything related to Trump, Biden. The mainstream media is reporting Joe Biden delivers a powerful address at D-Day Remembrance Ceremony, and then the conservative media is Joe Biden crapped himself.
Yeah, we can't seem to agree exactly on what's going on there.
All right, well, bringing it back closer to home,
Sure.
Obviously, let's talk about these congressional races, Dylan. South Carolina has 7 congressional seats. As our audience may not be aware, 4 of them, nothing's happening. There's either no opposition to the incumbents or only token opposition, but 3 of those 7 districts have some very competitive races. We're talking about the 1st district, which includes Charleston, Beaufort, the Low Country. We're talking about the 4th district, which includes the Greenville, Spartanburg, the very populous upstate region. And then we've got the 3rd district, which is actually the most conservative of the 3 we're talking about, which borders Georgia, includes 10 counties on the border between South Carolina and Georgia. Dylan, let's start in the 1st district. Incumbent Nancy Mace. She is a 2nd-term Republican. Last time, she was being challenged by Donald Trump. He was trying to take her out. This time, Trump's endorsing her. Who's she up against, and what are her prospects?
Well, she's up against Catherine Templeton. Catherine Templeton is a well-funded establishment candidate brought in largely because Nancy Mace made the bold vote to remove former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. That, of course, put a target on her back and put a target on the back of everybody who made that vote. Templeton was the DHEC secretary under Nikki Haley, so she certainly has a long history in South Carolina politics. There's a lot of people who respect her and what she did at that agency. That being said, we were actually supposed to be heading to Charleston right about now today. You want to tell folks why we were going to head down there?
Yeah, there was a court hearing down in Charleston for Hampton Templeton. This is one of Catherine Templeton's children, who was also a paid campaign staffer until earlier this year when he was arrested in connection with an assault charge. Now, he's being repped by Sean Kent, a lawyer, a very prominent lawyer here in the Palmetto State, very skilled attorney. But that hearing is happening, but Hampton Templeton will not be there. He's been excused by the office of the Ninth Circuit Solicitor. But this is an issue that has really bubbled up in this campaign, and a lot of folks have been sort of questioning, if you've got this sort of drama with your kid, and we're told this is not an isolated incident. The assault charge that has been filed against Hampton Templeton, we are told it is related to a pattern of behavior. And so the question is, why would you run for Congress when you got this kind of drama in your family?
Well, you could certainly ask that question, but can you point to me how many politicians don't have some similarly scandalous thing going on in their lives? I mean, you're about to have a segment here with Andy where you discuss something that is on the par with the politician who still seems to be receiving quite a bit of support.
That's true. And again, to me, the issue is simple. Who's going to be the best vote? And the thing I will say about this, if you look at Nancy Mace, Nancy Mace loves the media, loves the attention. She's definitely not shy about getting on television. Some would say she's made some unforced errors since she's been elected. In fact, pissed Trump off enough that he came out against her. But she survived that. Now she's getting hit by the GOP establishment. But, Dylan, I would say you look at her voting record, it's been pretty good on the fiscal issues that matter, or I think should matter to the people in that district.
Yeah, I mean, she does. She definitely goes her own way and votes whichever way she thinks is going to work for her district, which, as you say, has really ticked off different constituencies within the Republican Party at different times, depending on what she's done. I guess we're going to see on Tuesday whether she's made the right calls or whether she's done enough to tick off people back at home.
Well, it would be absolutely amazing to have a candidate, again, opposed by Trump in one election, survives, now opposed by the Washington Swamp in a second election.
And backed by Trump.
Yeah, and backed by Trump. And to see if she survives that race will be absolutely amazing. We'll keep a close eye on that election. Another incumbent facing a challenge, William Timmons. Obviously, folks who follow this show, we've covered William Timmons quite extensively. Yeah. The big sex scandal involving his
Which, by the way,
mistress.
two of our interesting races here in South Carolina are directly because our congressional representatives can't seem to keep their pants on at the appropriate times.
That is true. And William Timmons obviously it's no secret. He's acknowledged it. In fact, when this first came out, it was not something we were going to cover. We literally gave a heads up to his campaign.
Courtesy call.
Yeah, courtesy call. And they send back this on-the-record statement asking for prayers and privacy. Well, he may have asked, but he did not get that from that district. Dylan, this has been a story, the William Timmons Days of Our Congressman sex scandal. It's been going on 2 years. Timmons is in a dogfight because of this scandal, is he not?
Yeah, I don't think that anybody, prior to this would have expected this to be a close race. The Timmons family have reportedly hundreds of millions of dollars. William is a guy who votes the right way if you're a Republican. I don't think there's going to be too many Republicans who can really find a single vote that he's made since he's been there that is not acceptable. That being said, the upstate is an extremely socially conservative place, and he's facing South Carolina Freedom Caucus star, so to speak, Adam Morgan. He's a Bob Jones University graduate, which up there certainly has some sway, so he's tied in with those people. But it's been a very interesting race because there's some guys who you would think would be tied in with a candidate like Adam Morgan, mainly, the My SC GOP, Jeff Davis crowd, who, if folks follow the GOP civil war in South Carolina, know that that's a group that's not directly aligned with the state party, as the Freedom Caucus isn't, yet Jeff Davis and his crowd are backing Timmons. So this is really, again, it's another one of these races where we're just going to have to wait until Tuesday to see how it breaks, because it's certainly interesting dynamics.
Yeah, we're hearing the polling, by the way, in this race is close. Now, we talked about the first district race. We're hearing that Nancy Mace has a very comfortable lead in the first district. Again, we'll have to see if that ends up being accurate. But in the fourth district, we're told the race is very close. And it's interesting. We filed a report just this past week. We talked about it briefly on the month in review last week, talking about some documents that came to our attention that really confirmed a lot of the reporting that we did in that Days of Our Congressman scandal, particularly a piece of reporting involving a piece of property that Timmons deeded to his wife, now ex-wife, Sarah Timmons. And a lot of folks believe that this was part of it was part of a secret agreement, we now know. But at the time we reported that this property transfer was questionable because it was tied to an agreement that many believe purchased the silence.
It purchased more than the silence, we've learned.
Yeah, she's now
Purchased the support.
Yeah, the ex-wife.
Although we can't conclusively say that she wouldn't have done this without this property transfer. But it's certainly strange to have your husband be screwing around with other women and, you split up for that reason, and then you're out there, testifying to his character, which is exactly what Sarah Timmons has done throughout this campaign. William has publicly said on multiple occasions, I've got the support of my wife, Sarah, and she even issued a statement to our media outlet in support of her adulterous ex-husband.
A sternly worded statement, not only supporting her ex-husband, but also slamming Adam Morgan.
Yes, going after Adam, supporting William. And, the upstate, I think that the issue of adultery really matters, but it's interesting, how does this dynamic work as a whole? Because these are the same people that love Donald Trump, somebody who is certainly not the most monogamous husband.
That's a good point. And interesting, William Timmons does have the support of Donald Trump. That's a big endorsement that he got. However, Adam Morgan has some big local endorsements. The sheriff up there, Hobart Lewis, who's incredibly popular, he's supporting Adam Morgan, along with John Warren, the former gubernatorial candidate, who has continued to be very active in the conservative movement in South Carolina. So some of those local endorsements, at least on the conservative side, are really tracking toward Adam Morgan. Dylan, we've got one other race. We talked about it, that 3rd congressional district bordering Georgia. This one's been a lot quieter, but this seat became open after, guess what, a sex scandal that broke exclusively on FITSNews involving the former, or soon-to-be former, 3rd District Representative Jeff Duncan. After that story broke, he stepped down. A cattle call then commenced, multiple candidates jumping in. Leading the way, it appears, is Sherry Biggs. This is a nurse practitioner, military gal who seems to be really resonating, but then also the Freedom Caucus member Stuart Jones is in that race as well. We'll have to, again, follow whether or not that race, it seems like there could be a runoff.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of horses running. This is not a two-man race like we're seeing in some of these other districts. You kind of glossed over this scandal. I think that it's something that's pretty funny is that, he annually hosts the Faith and Freedom Rally, which is this big, successful event. I think he did this, which was as far as state-level political events go, that's
huge
really,
event.
really big numbers. And this year, the day after, his wife revealed that he had indeed been free, but he had been unfaithful. Yeah. So that's when that broke. But we talk about at this news outlet, you mentioned how we don't report on these sex scandals unless there's some sort of public element. This is an example of one that we had information about leading up to it breaking we knew about this before we knew about Timmons.
Years.
And folks think we're going to the presses with everybody that's sleeping around. It's only if there's a public element, which is why we waited for this to become a story of its own volition before we ever spoke about it publicly.
Yeah, those divorce files publicly filed. Not only that, the public comments related to it. So absolutely, we don't go looking for this stuff. But when it comes to us, if there's a component that lifts it up.
Well, once your wife starts talking about it publicly, you're an elected official. Now it's a story.
Yeah, at that point, it's kind of hard to ignore. And you get those clock copies of court files. It's a little hard to ignore those, too. We'll be talking about some of that in this next segment on some affair allegations. But Dylan, I want to shift gears with you. We're talking about these congressional races. Obviously, you mentioned the Morgan-Timmons race and how it's sort of a Republican establishment candidate versus a hardline conservative. But we are seeing a much bigger pitch battle along those lines in the South Carolina General Assembly, particularly in the South Carolina House of Representatives. And we've got the South Carolina GOP caucus, the Republican caucus, which is actively conspiring, I would say, with special interests to take out conservative members. Am I missing anything here?
Yeah, that's certainly one way to spin it. I think that South Carolina Freedom Caucus is also getting out-of-state dark money to wage their mailer wars against the in-state GOP.
Fair enough.
Now, I think both groups draw from the well of billionaires that don't live in South Carolina who want to exert political influence. Now, do you agree or disagree with what the Freedom Caucus members do? I think if you're a hardline conservative, you're certainly going to look at their policy agenda and support it. But what's very interesting is they have been a real thorn in the side of the mainstream GOP ever since the mainstream GOP made the calamitous mistake of ejecting them from the party, and that which resulted eventually through court order them legally being their own party. So they are pretty much permanently set up to be a thorn in the Republican Party side, because the Republican Party has barred these people from re-entry unless they give up all Freedom Caucus ties. And so their only way to beat them is at the ballot box. And so it has been an all-out brawl here this campaign season, because these Freedom Caucus guys are all fighting for their lives, and they're fighting against a slate of well-funded and certainly, as you mentioned, coordinated candidates who are moving in an attempt to eliminate them. Now, the Freedom Caucus is running enough candidates that, in theory, they could pick up a significant number of seats. However, I think, there's certainly a push to keep them from doing that. So if they come out of this election cycle holding, even just onto what they have, I think that would be a success for them. But it certainly remains to be seen, I think, with how many Republican primary voters feel about the country right now, with the legal oversteps, as many people see it, coming out of the Department of Justice, coming out of D.C., I do think that stuff will certainly be helpful for these more hardline conservative candidates. But who knows who's going to show up at the ballot box come Tuesday.
Absolutely. And also we have to ask who's already showed up, because early voting ended on Friday this week.
And they expect a significant portion of the vote to come in early.
Big chunk. We've heard 40%, possibly 50%, which is huge. And it completely changes the way these campaigns
I think some of the FITSNews staff have early voted. I have not voted yet. I don't know. I don't think you have.
No comment. Whatever. It's good to keep y'all guessing. Let me ask this question, though, Dylan. As we look at that landscape, you talk about whether or not the Freedom Caucus is going to pick up some seats. I made no bones about where I am. I endorsed their slate in a column this week. And my response to it was really to something that the Post and Courier wrote, because they wrote this article going after the Freedom Caucus members, saying that they needed to be defeated so that the legislature could get back to serving the people, and that Republicans and Democrats in Columbia just work together to serve the people and solve problems. Dylan, you've been covering South Carolina for a while now. Look at the outcomes in this state economically, with regard to public education, with regard to our infrastructure, with regard to safety in our communities and the surge in violent crime. I don't know who the hell they think these people are serving, but it's not the people of South Carolina.
Yeah, that's the thing, is I agree in principle that there are a lot of issues in government which are not inherently partisan issues. I think that whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you would like to be able to drive from point A to point B without getting your car damaged by a moon crater level pothole like we see in South Carolina. But unfortunately, Republicans and Democrats don't frequently work together to fix those kinds of problems, but rather to make sure that the contract for the concrete to fix that goes to their brother-in-law. That's just the kind of stuff that we see in our legislature all the time.
Good old boy system.
The good old boy system. And so if that's, what we're getting out of our bipartisan cooperation, we're cooperating to make sure that, when it's your turn at the top of the food chain after you put in your 20 years in the legislature, that you're the one that gets to bring those millions of dollars to your district and to your cronies. To that extent, I don't approve of that bipartisan cooperation. Now, if they're actually productively cooperating across partisan lines, then I agree with the Post and Courier. That's a good thing. But unfortunately, in South Carolina, when you start to dig in, you look to see what motivates the real power players. I'm not talking about your rank and file members who just vote, whatever they're told and enjoy their position in the party and their admiration from lobbyists and whatnot. The other reasons you go become a legislator. But the people at the top, I don't know that they're always motivated well, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And as you say in your column, the Freedom Caucus, even if you don't agree with every legislative tactic they use, some of it is a bit, barbaric. The fact that they're going in there and shaking this system up and really making these guys who haven't had to run competitive races in years actually keep them on their toes and let them know, hey, if you're giving your brother a DOT contract, we're going to primary you based off of that. I think that alone, as you say, is certainly a reason to tip your hat towards those guys.
Well, and again, it's not necessarily what they've done. It's, the check that they provide against that uniparty good old boy system. They are actually standing up and saying, hey, like you said, if you do this, we're going to call you out. And I think that is a valuable thing that South Carolina simply hasn't had for the last few decades. The other thing I pointed out in that column is that this, you mentioned it as well, this isn't about party, folks. Democrats, particularly white Democrats, ran this state for decades. And they literally ran it the same way that this current crop of white Republicans.
Well,
is
many
now
of them are
running.
literally the same people who just switched their party affiliation when it became clear that it was no longer politically viable to brand yourself a Democrat. But, I mean, they govern like Democrats because they still are Democrats. And I think it's shocking to a lot of people who pay attention to politics at a very surface level once they zone in and start saying, oh, these guys are growing government. They have no interest in reducing your tax rates. They have no interest in just taking, parts of life that are in the public domain and making them part of the private domain because that's what they inherently believe is better. No, a lot of these guys are trial lawyers who are just going to say whatever about themselves that they have to do to remain in office.
Yeah, and remain in power. And you mentioned the trial lawyers. Obviously, legislators pick the judges, which is something this media outlet has focused on. The corruption that's followed from that, the injustice that's followed from that, the inequity, the erosion of public safety, and the erosion of integrity of our judicial system as a result of that judicial selection process. And of course, nothing got done on it this year, just as no money was sent back to small businesses, no money was sent back to individual taxpayers. There was no reform of that corrupt judicial system because, again, they don't have an appetite for that. But Dylan, one thing I would point out, we talked about the Freedom Caucus and the check that they provide for the 3 years before the Freedom Caucus. The 3 years running up until they were formed and became a force at the Statehouse, South Carolina had the most fiscally liberal, Republican-controlled legislature in the entire country. The entire country, 3 years running. First year the Freedom Caucus is in there mixing things up. They didn't. So I think that, again, as a bottom-line guy, that would seem to me they're good for the bottom line.
Now let me provide the counter-argument, which I've had on the phone with some folks that, are tied with the establishment, and that is, well, that's the time that Merrill Smith became the speaker.
Oh,
These were all Merrill's victories. That's the other side there. So we'll see.
We'll see who the voters believe.
I don't think that most voters are even going to know that they're in the middle of this tug of war here, because it's not presented that way. I live in R.J. May's district. He's one of the Freedom Caucus leaders, chairman, and I don't get a mailer in my mailbox saying R.J. May is in the Freedom Caucus and the Freedom Caucus is bad for XYZ reason, because most Republican primary voters are going to see Freedom Caucus and think, freedom, good.
Yeah.
So instead, it's R.J. May, he's a caveman in this advertisement they sent to me. He looks like a caveman. He's got his little club, and it's talking about how he's, legislating, as I said, barbarically earlier. But there are certainly a slate of well-funded candidates. But I will say, talking to R.J. and just seeing what he's been doing throughout the district, which I live in, those Freedom Caucus guys are working hard. They're knocking doors all day, all night. So if these establishment candidates want to win, they're really going to have to put in the work, because they're going to be given a run for their money.
All right, so from Washington, D.C. to Columbia, we've been talking about all these races that are going to impact the power struggle at the South Carolina Statehouse. But our Andy Fancher has a report on a race that is going to impact some other things. Let's bring Andy in here and talk to him about a state Senate race that is drawing attention for another reason. So Dylan and I have been talking about all these political races, but the biggest political story we covered this week was from Andy Fancher, a Senate race in District 35, Sumter County.
District 35, yes, sir. I think approximately 100,000 people reside in this district, and while we have a few candidates vying, I'd say that the one that has certainly dominated our headlines in the past week is former Assistant Attorney General Christina Allard.
Right, top prosecutor running for the state Senate over there. It's a four-way Republican primary. Andy, this race has been generating buzz even before we started covering it. There were signs all over the district with a curious title.
Yes, here we have a Christina Allard homewrecker sign that started emerging sometime last week. They were short-lived at best, but we had been investigating this for approximately 2 weeks prior, and I'm not speaking confidently here when I say that I don't think I have spoken to more sources and more attorneys than any other story, but I think I'm pretty close when I say that. We were very careful with this because obviously it could be a damning report. It could cost somebody's election. So you know that I was definitely struggling with it a little bit. I dedicated days upon days, calls upon calls, talking to people to corroborate the personality of this person, talking to this person to corroborate the personality of that person. And it all led to a publishing yes. This week, I believe GOP candidate denies adulterous affair with Kershaw County Magistrate Judge Herbert Clay Caruth III.
And also, one of the things I'd point out to our audience, we have a very high bar for covering this stuff. I mean, if it's just an affair, we tend to kind of just let it go unless there's, taxpayer dollars, some alleged criminality. But in this case, Andy, or hypocrisy, if it's a candidate that says, oh, I'm for family values, and Ms. Allard has done that. She's got an ad that talks about family, oddly enough. But in this case, there were also some attendant allegations of ethical misconduct. And those were actually not just whispered, they were put on public documents, which, look at that.
They were put on public documents. This is an Office of Disciplinary Counsel complaint, one of 2 filed against Allard and her accused paramour, Kershaw County Magistrate Herbert Clay Caruth. So the documents allege that these 2 met while they were prosecuting within the 5th Judicial Circuit Solicitor's Office under Byron Gibson. And when she was promoted as an Assistant Attorney General to the state under Alan Wilson, the documents allege that this extramarital affair maintained. And that's where we are now. The ethical violations here all stem from her filing on April Fool's Day of this year, because her accused paramour has been picketing and campaigning alongside her,
which is a no-no for
since
judges.
her filing. Correct.
They're not supposed to do
you've
that.
got to maintain that impartiality, which, according to the person who filed these complaints, which is conveniently the father-in-law of her paramour, of her accused paramour, is alleging that there have been some electioneering for this race. And while, of course, Miss Allard has maintained her innocence, and to her credit, she has been responsive and she has been respectful to me.
I was going to ask you that. Did you find her convincing, relatable when you spoke with her?
I spoke with her. She denied the allegations, and she spoke to every point that I brought up with her.
And that doesn't always happen.
Hell no. Hell no. It's a miracle to get a hold of some of these people. In fact, if I'm going to take issue with anybody from the Thursday forum, it wouldn't even be Miss Allard. It would be another candidate who I had the pleasure of crossing paths with back at my former occupation at an MSM newsroom, who was historically unavailable for any issue under her watch. I'm not pointing fingers. This is not about that candidate. But, I've since seen some allegations on Facebook that I have political affiliations and political leanings, which I don't. I'm just relying on the facts. And the fact of the matter is that there's actually another candidate at the forum last night who was historically unavailable. And after being historically unavailable for that previous position, now it's time to run for Senate. So anyway, that's just my little soapbox about that. But yes, so that is what the accusations are here. We published Miss Allard's
detailed responses.
Detailed response to the accusations, which are patently false, categorically untrue. So one thing I do want to note here, because last night at the Thursday Sumter Republican Forum, she clapped back. She clapped back. She told the audience that she has been defamed. And she did discuss the active SLED investigation, which came by way, according to the ODC complaints, because private investigators mounted a tracker to her Jeep, as well as her accused paramour's pickup truck. She found the tracker, reported it to the Kershaw County Sheriff's Office. Kershaw County Sheriff's Office reported it up to SLED. I don't believe they knew at the time that it was a private investigator who is supporting the magistrate's wife in a divorce on the grounds of adultery. So
tangle web out in this.
What I will say here, right, and what I will say here is, okay, she has maintained her innocence. That is Christina Allard's answer locked in. She has been listed in divorce filings on the grounds of adultery. She has sustained 2 Office of Disciplinary Counsel complaints alleging that at least 6 rules across her and her accused paramour have been violated. And come Thursday's forum, she was served a subpoena. So that's the facts as we have them now. Yeah, so here's
served.
here's a photograph of Miss Allard being served quietly.
That doesn't happen at every candidate's debate, does it?
And then here's a photo of Miss Allard's mother waving at me. She didn't take her eyes off me at this forum on Thursday. And then here's actually a video of her almost intentionally positioning herself in front of my camera for the first many minutes of the forum.
She just wants a good shot, Andy. Come on.
She just wants a good shot.
She's trying to get a good shot.
Right.
Well, this is, again, a four-way race. And the craziest thing is that this bombshell has broken in the middle of early voting, which actually ended Friday. So we've got this early voting taking place. This hits. The primary election is on Tuesday, the 11th, this coming Tuesday. Four-way race. Any predictions on how this thing falls? Do you think people rally to the aggrieved candidate? Or do you think that this costs her votes, Andy? What's your take?
So that's a magnificent point, because I did speak with people at the forum last night, as well as just having spoken with so many people surrounding this report, surrounding these allegations, because, again, serious allegations. I'm not just going to haphazardly publish something. Oh, this document says this, time to go. No, that's not how we roll. And I believe that might have been why you told me about this, because you knew that I was going to go insane on being as accurate as possible. So predictions, that's a Dylan's job. I don't predict, but from what I've heard, and from what I noticed, she received a lot of applause at the Sumter GOP forum. And I don't know if they were sympathy applauses or if they were just truly rallying applauses. You have seen people coming out, many people coming out in defense of her on these allegations. And to her credit, she has turned it into, look, I have been tracked. I have been photographed. Not uncommon for a senatorial candidate to be photographed. I have been subject to 2 ODC complaints, and I'm still fighting, and I will maintain this fight at the Senate. So, I mean, yes, an assistant attorney general has maintained a good defense.
Well, that is definitely one of the races we will be following this Tuesday. Again, so many of these elections start and end with coverage here on FITSNews. We break the stories that frame the narratives. We cover those stories, following them all again on behalf of the citizens and taxpayers of the state. We talked about the Statehouse races, state Senate races, congressional districts. Again, keep it tuned here not only for the coverage of those elections and the outcomes, but more importantly, the fallout and how it will impact you as citizens and taxpayers of the Palmetto State. All right, that's a wrap for this week's show. I'm going to go try and hydrate to get back in the groove for next week as we continue to bring you coverage on all these big stories and everything we're covering at FITSNews.com. That reminds me, I want to thank Dylan Nolan, Andy Fancher, Jen Wood, Callie Lyons, our whole team for the work they've done this past week on all the stories we've been covering. And that reminds me, if you haven't already, please support the work we're doing by subscribing to FITSNews.com. It's only $8 a month, but it empowers everything we do here to hold those in power accountable to you. We'll catch you next time on your